A maple edge grain cutting board has a really nice classic look to it, and with a couple of strips of walnut and cherry to spice it up, this is one of my favorite cutting board designs. I'll show you how I made this cutting board, the jigs that I use, and a number of tips along the way. So let's get started. After cutting some pieces of maple, walnut, and cherry to just over 18 inches on the miter saw, then I used the table saw to rip the pieces to 1.5 inches wide. These pieces will be turned on edge, and therefore the width of this cut will determine the thickness of the cutting board. I'm shooting for a 1 3/8 inch thick final size, so I leave maybe 1/8 of an inch that I might lose to the planer after glue up. Just to double down on that point for clarity, here's the board that I just ripped into 3 pieces. Then each piece gets turned up on edge to be glued together to make the cutting board. The pattern that I'm wanting to create requires some thinner pieces, so I take a piece each of walnut, cherry, and maple to the bandsaw and resaw it down to just a little less than 1/2 an inch. Then I just clean up that bandsaw cut with the planer to have a good glue surface. Also want to make an important note that not all the pieces are just your typical 3/4 inch thick. I think it's really important to use differing sizes. It really makes a difference in the look and the character of the final cutting board, especially in a cutting board that's predominantly a single species of wood like this. So I incorporate a few pieces that are cut from some 1 inch thick stock. It's sold as 5/4. I also take the thin cut off from the resaw that I did earlier, and I slip that in just to mix it up a little bit. Before gluing it up, I take some time to make sure that each piece fits nicely with the piece next to it, both from the aesthetics of the grain patterns, but also looking for any warp or twist in the boards. Using a combination of the joiner and the planer, I just carefully work to make sure that the joint between each board is as tight as possible. There are a lot of surfaces here to glue up, and it takes a little bit of time to get the glue spread and everything ready to clamp. I'm not using the normal Titebond glue here, but instead I'm using Titebond 3, which is the right glue for a couple of reasons. First, it has a little bit slower set time, so it gives me a little more time to get all the pieces together. Also, it's waterproof and it's FDA approved food safe, so it makes sense for cutting boards. I'll put a link in the description below for the specific glue that I'm using here. This may seem like a lot of clamps for only an 18-inch long cutting board, but since these individual pieces are so narrow, then clamps closer together are important to get an even distribution of pressure. Not more pressure, I'm not really cranking down too hard on each clamp, but just after an even distribution of pressure. When the glue is dry, I realize I didn't do a very good job of cleaning off the glue when it was wet, and I don't want to run it through the planer like this. So I do a little bit of sanding to knock down the majority of the dried glue. After a couple of shallow passes on the planer, I noticed some chipping out of the grain. It's really hard to avoid it the way I glued up the boards with the grain running in all different directions. Yeah, I wish I had one of those big drum sanders, but since I don't, then I finish off the process of getting it flat with my sander. I use a straight edge to check it for flatness in all directions, including diagonally. I also like to take it inside to the kitchen where it'll be used and just double check that it sits absolutely flat. Mark any high spots and go back to the sander just to get the flatness dialed in perfectly. By using a crosscut sled on my table saw, I'm able to clean up the edges and square up the cutting board. To cut the juice grooves, I'm using this jig that I built last year. It's on a 3/4 inch plywood base with inset T-track to allow the fences to be adjustable so that I can use it for kind of any reasonable size cutting board. One fence is in a fixed position just screwed down to the base. This fence moves lengthwise, and the fence on the end moves in all directions, and then the other fence just moves in and out. It's kind of confusing to explain. Let me just show you. I set the board in and line it up against the fence that's fixed, and then going around counterclockwise, I just adjust and set each of the other fences, and it's ready for the router. I adjust the router depth to start with the shallow cut. I'm making a few shallow passes, just increasing the depth of the cut a little bit each time. Just feels less risky than a single deep cut. And I'm careful to move the router around counterclockwise so the rotation of the blade kind of naturally pulls the router against the fence. I just take my time and I'm careful, and the result is a perfect juice groove. I had sped up the video there so you could see the whole process pretty quickly, but just to get a feel for the pace at which I was moving the router, here's a clip with it at actual speed. Then I put a really small round over on all the edges using the router. Or doing a bevel would also be nice. Depending on the cutting board, I do one or the other, just something to take off the sharp edge. To cut the handles on the ends of the cutting board, I'm going to use a 3/4 inch round bit in the router table. This jig that I made really makes it easy to help me get the handle centered properly. You could probably just put a couple of stop blocks on the router fence and that would work fine. You wouldn't need this jig. But what this jig does, with the stops at each end perfectly centered, it just makes it easier. And it effectively gives me a fence on each side of the cutting board so that I can move the board in either direction without worrying about it kind of jumping away from the fence. Just makes it a little less stressful cut. Easy and less stress makes woodworking a more enjoyable hobby for me, so that makes the time and effort all worth it to make this jig. Once the fence and the jig are all lined up, I just make a few shallow passes, just increasing the depth of the cut each time. With just a little bit of hand sanding, the cutting board now has really nice handles on each end. So now it's time for the dreaded and boring sanding process. I start with 120 grit and then 150 grit. And then I spray it down with water to raise the grain before sanding with 220. This will prevent the cutting board from getting that fuzzy feeling the first time you wash it. After it dries, then I sand it with 220 grit. And then I raise the grain again by spraying it with water one more time. And then the final sanding is just with 220 grit again, but really light hand-only sanding this time. I'm using a food-safe mineral oil to finish it with. It's really easy to apply, just rub it all over and leave it pretty wet to sit overnight. Then the final step is to wipe on and buff out some cutting board wax. This stuff also contains a bit of mineral oil, so maybe you could say the prior step of applying the mineral oil wasn't necessary, but I think for a fresh cutting board it really needs that initial soak. Then periodically, as the board gets used over time, just reapply this cutting board wax every now and then. I'll include a link to it in the description below. I just love the classic look of a maple butcher block style cutting board. Thanks for watching.